War by Karl von Clausewitz. Read by Steadyy Ddελτα. Chapter 1. What is War? Part 9. In war, the result is never final. Lastly, even the ultimate outcome of a war is not always to be regarded as final. The defeated state often considers the outcome merely as a transitory evil, for which a remedy may still be found in political conditions at some later date. It is obvious how this, too, can slacken tension and reduce the vigor of the effort. Part 10. The probabilities of real life replace the extreme and the absolute required by theory. Warfare thus eludes the strict theoretical requirement that extremes of force be applied. Once the extreme is no longer feared or aimed at, it becomes a matter of judgment what degree of effort should be made, and this can only be based on the phenomena of the real world and the laws of probability. Once the antagonists have ceased to be mere figments of a theory and become actual states and governments, when war is no longer a theoretical affair but a series of actions obeying its own peculiar laws, reality supplies the data from which we can deduce the unknown that lies ahead. From the enemy's character, from his institutions, the state of his affairs, and his general situation, each side, using the laws of probability, forms an estimate of its opponent's likely course and acts accordingly. Part 11. The political object now comes to the fore again. A subject which we last considered in Section 2 now forces itself on us again, namely, the political object of the war. Hitherto, it had been rather overshadowed by the law of extremes, the will to overcome the enemy and make him powerless. But as this law begins to lose its force, and as this determination wanes, the political aim will reassert itself. If it is all a calculation of probabilities based on given individuals and conditions, the political object, which was the original motive, must become an essential factor in the equation. The smaller the penalty you demand from your opponent, the less you can expect him to try and deny it to you. The smaller the effort he makes, the less you need to make yourself. Moreover, the more modest your own political aim, the less importance you attach to it, and the less reluctantly you will abandon it if you must. This is another reason why your effort will be modified. The political object, the original motive for the war, will thus determine both the military objective to be reached and the amount of effort it requires. The political object cannot, however, in itself provide the standard of measurement. Since we are dealing with realities, not with abstractions, it can do so only in the context of the two states at war. The same political object can elicit differing reactions with different peoples, and even from the same people at different times. We can therefore take the political object as a standard only if we think of the influence it can exert upon the forces it is meant to move. The nature of those forces therefore calls for study. Depending on whether their characteristics increase or diminish the drive toward a particular action, the outcome will vary. Between two peoples and two states, there can be such tensions, such a mass of inflammable material, that the slightest quarrel can produce a wholly disproportionate effect, a real explosion. This is equally true of the efforts a political object is expected to arouse in either state, and of the military objectives which their policies require. Sometimes the political and military objective is the same, for example, the conquest of a province. In other cases, the political object will not provide a suitable military objective, In that event, another military objective must be adopted that will serve the political purpose and symbolize it in the peace negotiations. But here, too, attention must be paid to the character of each state involved. There are times when, if the political object is to be achieved, the substitute must be a good deal more important. The less involved the population, and the less serious the strains within states and between them, the more political requirements in themselves will dominate and tend to be decisive. Situations can thus exist in which the political object will almost be the sole determinant. Generally speaking, a military objective that matches the political object in scale will, if the latter is reduced, be reduced in proportion. This will be all the more so as the political object increases its predominance. Thus, it follows that without any inconsistency, wars can have all the degrees of importance and intensity, ranging from a war of extermination down to simple armed observation. This brings us to a different question, which now needs to be analyzed and answered. Part 12. An interruption of military activity is not explained by anything yet said. However modest the political demands may be on either side, however small the means employed, however limited the military objective, can the process of war ever be interrupted, even for a moment? The question reaches deep into the heart of the matter. Every action needs a certain time to be completed. That period is called its duration, and its length will depend on the speed with which the person acting works. We need not concern ourselves with the difference here. Everyone performs a task in his own way. A slow man, however, does not do it more slowly because he wants to spend more time over it, but because his nature causes him to need more time. If he made more haste, he would do the job less well. His speed then is determined by subjective causes and is a factor in the actual duration of the task. Now, if every action in war is allowed its appropriate duration, we would agree that, at least at first sight, any additional expenditure of time, any suspension of military action, seems absurd. In this connection, it must be remembered that what we are talking about is not the progress made by one side or the other, but the progress of military interaction as a whole. Part 13. Only one consideration can suspend military action, and it seems that it can never be present on more than one side. If two parties have prepared for war, some motive of hostility must have brought them to that point. Moreover, so long as they remain under arms, do not negotiate a settlement, that motive of hostility must still be active. Only one consideration can restrain it: a desire to wait for a better moment before acting. At first sight, one would think this desire could never operate on more than one side, since its opposite must automatically be working on the other. If action would bring an advantage to one side, the other's interest must be to wait. But an absolute balance of forces cannot bring about a standstill, for if such a balance should exist, the initiative would necessarily belong to the side with the positive purpose, the attacker. One could, however, conceive of a state of balance in which the side with the positive aim, the side with the stronger grounds for action, was the one that had the weaker forces. The balance would then result from the combined effects of aim and strength. Were that the case, one would have to say that unless some shift in the balance were in prospect, the two sides should make peace. If, however, some alteration were to be foreseen, only one side could expect to gain by it, a fact which ought to stimulate the other into action. Inaction clearly cannot be explained by the concept of balance. The only explanation is that both are waiting for a better time to act. Let us suppose, therefore, that one of the two states has a positive aim, say the conquest of a part of the other's territory, to use for bargaining at the peace table. Once the prize is in its hands, the political object has been achieved. There is no need to do more, and it can let matters rest. If the other state is ready to accept the situation, it should sue for peace. If not, it must do something, and if it thinks it will be better organized for action in 4 weeks' time, it clearly has an adequate reason for not taking action at once. But from that moment on, logic would seem to call for action by the other side, the object being to deny the enemy the time he needs for getting ready. Throughout all this, I have assumed, of course, that both sides understand the situation perfectly. Part 14. Continuity would thus be brought about in military action and would again intensify everything. If this continuity were really to exist in the campaign, its effect would again be to drive everything to extremes. Not only would such ceaseless activity arouse men's feelings and inject them with more passion and elemental strength, but events would follow more closely on each other and be governed by a stricter causal chain. Each individual action would be more important and consequently more dangerous. But war, of course, seldom if ever shows such continuity. In numerous conflicts, only a very small part of the time is occupied by action, while the rest is spent in inactivity. This cannot always be an anomaly. Suspension of action in war must be possible. In other words, it is not a contradiction in terms. Let me demonstrate this point and explain the reasons for it.